They shoved me off the cliff. They laughed as the wheels spun, and for a heartbeat, between the drop and the scream, I thought I was going to be erased. That's where this story begins, and if you've ever felt small in a room full of people, if you've ever been the one everyone walked around like a pothole, then listen close. This one's for you. My name is Maya Rivera. I grew up in Millstone, a place where the river remembers everything we try to forget. It's a town stitched together by hard work and harder secrets, worn hands, and hush money. And I was the kind of kid who learned early that staying visible was dangerous. At 16, I used a wheelchair, a fact that made some folks pity me, or worse, write me off. But pity is easy. Cruelty is cheaper, and Cole Anders learned how to use both like a swaggering badge. You meet Cole in high school hallways. Varsity jacket father owns the brickworks on the ridge, smile like a gun. He didn't just tease, he weaponized indifference, and he had friends who followed his jokes the way dogs follow a scent. One morning in sophomore year, he blocked my path and said flat as a headline, "Move it, wreck. This hall's for real kids." Ethan, who laughed behind him, tipped my lunch onto my lap like it was the punchline of the day. There were teachers who watched, Miss Harper among them, hands trembling, and then looked away. Silence was the currency. Cole held most of it. I could tell you about the small humiliations, the sticky notebooks, the nights I scrubbed my hands raw under cold water so the school couldn't smell me crying. But the thing that turned everything, that bent the story into something dangerous and honest, was the notebook. Not just any notebook, but my father's ledger, the one he'd kept about the brickworks waste dumps, the one that said our river had been used as a trash can for barrels of poison. People said his death was an accident, a drunk truck off the road. Convenient tidy. But when I heard Cole and his crew whispering in the boys' locker room, when I heard them say, "My old man says Johnson took his secrets to the grave," something inside me froze and then lit up. That night I should have told someone official. I didn't. Not because I was weak, but because in Millstone officials came with pockets lined and mouths sealed. So I kept the ledger in my backpack and the fear in my chest. I recorded what I heard. I told myself I would find a way to make the town see, because silence was what killed people here, not the work on the ridge. The turning point was supposed to be a school team-building hike to Raven's Bluff, a place seniors said turned good kids, brave, and bad kids quiet. Instead, Cole and his cronies drove me down a side trail off the path where the pines get thick and the ground turns hungry. The scene was cinematic, and I mean that in the worst way. Sunlight slicing through trees, their shadows like knives, the cliff yawning open like it wanted to swallow a whole life. Cole barreled the chair, pushed it to the edge, and said with a grin that tasted like cold money, "Say hi to your old man when you hit bottom. You don't get ready to die in 1 second. You get ready in 100 tiny betrayals before it, in the way the town taught itself to look away." Still, something broke inside me then. Not my courage, but the bargain I'd been making with fear. I wasn't going to be quiet. I pulled a small can from my jacket, a last-minute thing my mom insisted on, pepper spray, and sprayed it blindly into Ethan's face when he leaned in to laugh. Chaos. Cole pushed harder. The chair pitched. I screamed, the sound of it rolling away with me into the blue, and for a second the air was only a throat and the cliff and the river below. If I had to design the perfect rescue, I wouldn't have picked the Iron Ravens, a motorcycle crew who lived like they'd already been written off by polite society. But there's an honesty in people who have nothing to prove but everything to lose, and two of them, Ryder and Big Joe, came tearing through the trees like weather. Ryder grabbed the chair, one hand like wire, and for a second his fingertips brushed my world and pulled me back. Hands dug into roots, voices in the trees turned to a roar, and when I finally lay on the grass, my lungs full of air and somebody's jacket across my shivering shoulders, I realized what power looks like without a badge. That rescue should have closed the chapter. A cliff, a miracle the town sighs and moves on. But Millstone doesn't disperse ghosts so easily. The ledger, the recording, the bruises, they all became fuel. My mom, Lena, she worked nights at the county clinic and knew how to stitch a story back together, and she knew how costly that could be. So when our house burnt 2 nights later, we understood the message. Not an accident. Arson. The photograph albums, Dad's old hat, everything that tied us to him turned to ash. We lost much more than things that night. We almost lost everything. Facing the kind of power that makes arson look like a detail meant we had to be smarter than scared. Ryder, hardened, scarred, but with a soft corner for my mom because she once saved him when he bled out on a freezing night, put together a band of unlikely witnesses. They didn't have legal briefs, they had cameras, bikes, and a willingness to throw their weight in front of a hospital door. We took the Ledger to a late-night radio station where a kid named Jamie spun country tracks and looked like he might run at the first sign of trouble. He didn't. He opened the mic, hands trembling, and I read my father's words and pressed play on the recording of Cole laughing about sending my dad to the grave. Radio is old school, but in Millstone, radios are in pickups and porches and diners. People stopped. Some started at first light, others pressed redial. The station's little signal turned into something bigger, a mirror tossed at the town's face. Calls came in, people sobbed, neighbors who had been hushed for decades started naming names. The Ledger matched the recordings. The Ledger matched the illnesses and the dead, and like a match in a dry field, the city caught. When the sheriff's office finally couldn't keep the lid on, not because they wanted to, but because we made it impossible to pretend nothing was happening, it splintered. Deputies who'd played footsie with the Sterlings were exposed. Cole and his father were arrested not by a community willing to silently nod anymore, but under the weight of evidence and raw public fury. The Iron Ravens lined up outside the hospital like a metal wall, not to threaten, but to make sure an order from the well-funded could not simply cart me away for observation and bury the truth. There are things justice can't mend. Burned photo albums, lost time, bruises on a teenager's chest. But it can make a town listen. In the weeks after Millstone was messy. People fought in grocery store aisles, ministers and miners argued in front of the courthouse, old men who'd been afraid to speak stood up and said they remembered seeing barrels at the river. Harlan, the kid who went along with cruelty because he was scared of his own father, finally handed me a sealed envelope with more paperwork, his hands shaking, and asked for forgiveness like a wounded animal. I accepted that he had to start somewhere small because I knew redemption was a long, ugly journey, not a headline. Months later, the quarries were slapped with investigations, the county set up restitution. The river got monitors, and Millstone held a potluck on a ragged lawn where people brought ribs and pie and their apologies. Ryder flipped burgers with grease under his nails. Big Joe joked like a man who had relearned how to laugh, and my mom, Lena, smiled with her whole face for the first time since Dad died. I was awarded a scholarship, a chance to get out and learn how to tell other people's stories without being afraid, and I placed a published copy of Dad's ledger on his stone, like proof that someone had finally read what he'd written. This isn't a tidy ending. Cole's trial dragged through the news, some folks still whispered, and scars physical and otherwise didn't vanish with a verdict. But the town changed its tune. Where once we had turned our faces from people in need, now there were meetings, hotlines, a bystander program in school, and kids who'd seen what happens when you do nothing. They started to act. I started a weekly group at the library called Bridges, a place where kids could say what they'd seen without being laughed at. And people came hesitant at first, then hungry for the chance to help. If there's one thing I'm certain of, it's this. Courage is ordinary until it's needed. It looks like a pepper spray can in a jacket. It looks like a biker's hand that won't let go. It looks like a kid who finally presses play on a tape. It looks like a town that decides it's done covering up the truth. And it looks like you in whatever small way you choose to use your voice. So tell me, what do you think? Was I right to go on the radio instead of the police? Do you believe a community can rebuild after it has been bought and silenced, or are wounds too deep? Have you ever seen someone pushed aside and wondered if you should step in? And what held you back? Drop a comment. Argue with me. Agree with me. Tell your story. If this moved you, share it, subscribe, and let's start conversations people in places like Millstone wish they'd had years ago. Because real change begins when we stop pretending we can't hear the scream.